Good morning, I'm Shelly Conway, and today on NYC Today, we are going to be interviewing artist Catherine Torres on her upcoming piece. Unfortunately, Catherine is on vacation and couldn't make it into the studio, but we are going to be Skyping her from her vacation in Peru. Good morning, Catherine. My first question is, using one of your examples, describe the importance of your chosen archetype in relation to contemporary politics, ethics, or everyday life.
One way that my archetype is still very relevant today is in our recent political election. In this election, there were two candidates who were complete opposites of each other. This was very influential because the candidates agreed on almost nothing. There was no middle ground, there was no compromise. And if one candidate had a characteristic that you liked, the other candidate had the opposite characteristic. And it just gave you more reason to dislike that candidate and like the other one.
My second question is, if you were to pick another archetype as a lens for viewing your collage, what archetype would you choose, and how would some of your images then connect to one another?
If I were to pick another lens to view my collage through, I would pick the lens of the villain. In many works of literature, TV shows, and movies, the villain and the foil can be very similar and often serve some of the same functions. For example, in Harry Potter, Draco Malfoy is the foil to Harry. He's not the villain, but he can serve the role of a villain and the bad guy at some time. Villains and foils can also be compared because they serve the purpose of making the hero look better. The foil has contrasting characteristics that makes the hero look better, and so does the villain. But the villain also provides the opportunity and the situation for the hero to showcase their greatness and what makes them a hero.
Next, was there a purpose to how you arranged your images?
In my collage, I arranged my images around the silhouette of a hero. And I chose foils that were specifically dark and the foils that we didn't like. And I chose these dark images to highlight how the darkness and the bad qualities of a foil can highlight the lightness and the brightness of the hero. And that is why the silhouette of the hero is in white and my images are mostly darker colors.
How do the images relate to each other? And what does the combination of them reveal about your ideas? Can you pick a few to talk about?
Two images that I arranged very specifically was the image of Lydia in front of the image of the Black Raven. I did this because the Black Raven symbolizes a lot of misfortune and bad luck, and that is what Lydia had throughout the course of this book. First of all, she was raised by parents who either were the cause of her bad characteristics or just didn't care about her. And she also got trapped in an unhappy marriage but couldn't tell anyone about it because otherwise her family would just say, I told you so.
Is your archetype portrayed in the text with mostly positive words, negative words, or about equal? Also, a follow-up question. How does this change from text to text? How does specific language that describes your archetype changes the style of the text changes?
Throughout the course of the novel, Lydia is almost always described using very negative language. One example of this is when Elizabeth is talking to her father about Lydia and says that she is vain, ignorant, idle, and absolutely uncontrolled. Elizabeth also says, our importance, our respectability in the world must be affected by the wild volatility, the assurance and disdain of all restraint which mark Lydia's character. These are some pretty awful things to say about a person, and it's important to point out the fact that they come from Elizabeth. Elizabeth is the main character, and a lot of the book, although it's third person, is through her point of view. Because Elizabeth is the protagonist, we are on her side. And now, when we see Lydia, who is described awfully, next to Elizabeth, it makes Elizabeth look brighter and more heroic and more graceful. Another character that's portrayed in my collage is Unferth from Beowulf. Much like Lydia, the words that are used to describe Unferth are very negative, and they often come from the mouth of the protagonist, who is Beowulf. When Beowulf comes to help Hrothgar, Unferth says, or the narrator says, speaking about Unferth, a son of... When Beowulf comes to help Hrothgar, Unferth's first reaction is jealousy. The narrator says, Unferth, a son of Eglaf, spoke contrary words. Beowulf's coming, his sea-braving made him sick with envy. He could not brook or abide the fact that anyone else alive under heaven might enjoy greater regard than he did. This very much contrasts Beowulf because it shows how insecure Unferth is, whereas Beowulf is very confident and assured of himself and doesn't get intimidated by anything. Later, when Unferth begins insulting Beowulf's battle with Breca in the water, Beowulf responds by saying, now I cannot recall any fight you entered, Unferth, that bears comparison. I don't boast when I say that neither you nor Breca were much celebrated for swordsmanship. or for facing danger on the field of battle. So this shows how Unferth is insecure and he's insulting Beowulf, but Beowulf points out that Unferth has no stories to tell. He has no stories of battle. So it shows how Beowulf is much stronger and much more brave than Unferth is, and that Beowulf has stories to tell the world, and that shows how much more of a hero he is when compared to Unferth. One thing that was very different between these characters was that Unferth was a much more one-dimensional character. He didn't really advance the plot or anything. He just kind of was there. He showed how, by contrast with him, that Beowulf was very brave and secure and confident. But Lydia's character was a lot more complex. She was Elizabeth's sister, so even though Elizabeth didn't necessarily like everything about her, Elizabeth still loved her and Elizabeth still cared for her. And this is evident in how she reacts after she hears about Lydia running away. It's also more complicated because Unferth is basically outright rude to Beowulf and they just don't like each other. But Lydia is very young and her actions can be attributed to her immaturity more than her actual character, so it makes it a lot more complicated. This shows how throughout the years, authors like Jane Austen and many others have taken the archetype of the foil and changed it and manipulated it and made it a lot more complicated and complex than it originally was.
Well, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you for having me.